The night ended not with boardroom triumph or headlines, but with Daniel falling asleep against his shoulder in the car ride home. For once, Jonathan didn't feel the weight of loss in that surrender. He felt only gratitude, for the boy who had softened him, and for the man who had shown him how to listen differently. Yet he also knew the story was not finished. His company teetered, his reputation was at risk, and his growing dependence on Marcus unsettled him with questions he was not ready to confront. Change had begun, but its cost and its reward remained to be seen. The storm that had been brewing around Jonathan finally broke. His company's hostile takeover battle escalated into a war that dominated headlines, painting him as a distracted leader unfit to hold his empire together. Competitors sensed blood, circling with offers and threats, while investors demanded reassurance that the Hale name was still worth their loyalty. Jonathan's calendar, once a fortress of precision, now looked fractured, consumed by emergency meetings, legal disputes, and frantic negotiations. Yet even in the chaos, Daniel remained the quiet heartbeat at the center of his world. Marcus stood firm beside them, a steady presence in a life that had become a hurricane. Jonathan found himself leaning more heavily on the man, not only for Daniel's sake but for his own. There were moments when he questioned what Marcus saw in this constant whirlwind of wealth and anxiety. But every time Jonathan faltered, Marcus reminded him of a truth that could not be bought, that Daniel's needs did not bend to the fluctuations of the market, and neither should his father. The breaking point came on a night when Jonathan was forced to choose between appearing before the board to cast a decisive vote or staying at the hospital, where Daniel had been admitted after a severe panic attack triggered by overstimulation at school. The boy's small frame lay curled on a bed too large for him. His dinosaur clutched to his chest, monitors beeping softly in the dim room. Marcus sat vigil, calming him with patient words, while Jonathan stood torn between duty and devotion. His phone buzzed relentlessly with urgent reminders. The board was waiting. Billions hung in the balance. For the first time, Jonathan silenced the device completely. He walked to his son's bedside and sat down, ignoring the tailored suit that wrinkled beneath him. His hand reached for Daniel's, hesitant at first, but this time the boy didn't recoil. Slowly, Daniel's tiny fingers wrapped around his father's, fragile yet certain. It was a gesture that shattered the steel in Jonathan's heart. The world could burn beyond those walls, but nothing was more real than the warmth of that touch. The following morning, the news announced the company had slipped from Jonathan's control. The empire he had built from nothing was gone, swallowed by rivals who now gloated over his fall. To the world, it was a tragedy, a humiliation of the highest order. For Jonathan, it was strangely liberating. He had always believed his identity was bound to his empire, that without it he was nothing. But in the quiet of that hospital room, watching his son breathe evenly in sleep, Jonathan realized he had never been more of a man than in the moment he chose to stay. Marcus found him at the window, staring out at the city that once bowed to his will. "You've lost everything," Marcus said quietly, not as an accusation but as acknowledgement. Jonathan shook his head. "No. I finally chose the one thing that matters." That was the turning point. The weeks that followed were brutal. Lawsuits, investigations, interviews dripping with condescension. Jonathan was no longer the titan of industry but the cautionary tale of excess. Yet while the world stripped him of power, Daniel began to blossom. The boy, once cocooned in silence, started speaking more, laughing at odd times, even holding Jonathan's hand willingly. Each moment felt like a treasure, earned not by wealth but by presence. One evening, Daniel surprised them both by dragging Jonathan into the restaurant where Marcus still worked part-time despite Jonathan's protests. It was the place where everything had begun, the messy, ordinary space where Marcus had first coaxed Daniel to eat. Jonathan, humbled and weary, sat at the same booth and watched as his son ordered for himself, halting but clear. The waitress smiled warmly, unaware of the gravity of what she was witnessing. To Jonathan, it was nothing short of a miracle. After dinner, Marcus walked them home. The city lights glowed against the night sky, and Jonathan felt the weight of what he needed to say pressing against his chest. At the door he turned to Marcus. "You've given me more than I ever deserved. You showed me how to be a father. I don't know how to repay that." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "You don't repay it. You live it. That's all Daniel needs." Jonathan nodded, the truth of it sinking deeper than any business lesson he had ever learned. For the first time, he did not feel like a man at the helm of something vast and unreachable. He felt like a father standing at the threshold of a future that might finally hold meaning. The climax came quietly, without fanfare or cameras. It was on a simple afternoon in the park when Daniel, running ahead, turned back and called out a word Jonathan had never heard from him before. "Dad!" The sound froze him in place, tearing through every barrier he had built around his heart. Jonathan dropped to his knees as Daniel ran into his arms, clutching him with a force that no market, no empire, no fortune could rival. For the first time, Jonathan truly wept, not from loss, but from the overwhelming abundance of love he had been blind to for so long. In that moment everything crystallized. The central conflict of his life, the struggle between empire and family, control and vulnerability, was resolved not by victory in the boardroom, but by surrender to the role he had once feared most. He was no longer the billionaire CEO who defined himself by acquisitions and deals. He was simply a father, imperfect but present, broken yet whole, and it was enough. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass, Marcus watched from a distance, arms folded, a small smile on his face. He had guided Jonathan to the water, but it was Jonathan who had finally chosen to drink. And in that choice, he had gained far more than he had ever lost. The story closed not with a roar of triumph, but with the quiet peace of a man who had finally understood what it meant to be alive. For his son, for himself, and for the life he had nearly missed in pursuit of everything else. Jonathan's world was built on the foundation of control. Every merger, every acquisition, every calculated risk had been the product of his iron will. Yet the one relationship that mattered most, his bond with his son, remained beyond his reach. In the weeks following his repeated visits to the restaurant, Jonathan found himself caught in the tension between two worlds. The empire that demanded his unrelenting attention and the fragile, flickering connection that Marcus seemed to ignite between him and Daniel. It was not a balance he was accustomed to managing, and it left him feeling raw, stripped of the certainty that had always defined him. He began sneaking moments in the middle of his regimented days to see Marcus, sometimes without Daniel, sometimes with him. At first, he told himself it was practical, that he was studying Marcus's methods, learning from observation. But beneath that justification was a deeper truth. Marcus had become a tether, a man who reminded him of everything he had neglected while chasing boardroom dominance. Marcus's quiet strength and grounded humility stood in stark contrast to the sharks Jonathan swam with daily. The central conflict became unavoidable one Friday evening, when Jonathan's board demanded his presence at an emergency meeting over a crumbling international deal. The negotiations were spiraling, billions were at stake, and Jonathan knew his reputation could suffer irreparable damage if he did not personally intervene. But that night was also Daniel's first school recital, a rare event where his son had agreed to participate, on the condition that Marcus would be there too. For the first time in years, Daniel had shown eagerness to engage in something public, something shared. Jonathan stood at the edge of a decision that would define more than his portfolio. It would define the kind of father he was willing to become. He arrived at the recital late, his phone buzzing endlessly in his pocket with urgent messages from his partners. The auditorium smelled of floor wax and crayons, the lights harsh and unpolished compared to the glittering stages he was used to. Children shuffled nervously on stage, some waving to their parents, others whispering their lines under their breath. Daniel stood at the far edge, clutching his toy dinosaur tightly, his gaze flickering across the crowd in search of something familiar. When his eyes finally met Jonathan's, they lingered briefly before darting to Marcus, seated in the row ahead, giving him a reassuring nod. Only then did Daniel step forward. Jonathan sat frozen, watching his son recite a few halting lines. His voice was soft but audible, his hands trembling yet steadying with Marcus's subtle encouragement. When the children finished and the applause filled the room, Jonathan realized he was clapping harder than anyone. Yet the pride swelling in his chest was shadowed by shame. His son had looked for Marcus first, not him. The truth was undeniable. Daniel trusted Marcus more than his own father. That night, after dropping Daniel home, Jonathan invited Marcus into his penthouse for the first time. The sleek glass walls overlooked the city like a kingdom. But Marcus's gaze lingered not on the skyline, but on the boys' play corner tucked into the side of the living room, a small cluster of toys untouched, their presence more symbolic than functional. "Does he ever play here?" Marcus asked gently. Jonathan exhaled, loosening his tie. "Not often. He prefers the spaces where he feels safe." "And this doesn't feel safe to him," Marcus observed, not as a question but as a truth. "It looks like a display, not a place to belong." Jonathan bristled, unused to critique in his own home. Yet as he looked at the pristine, dustless toys arranged by staff, he realized Marcus was right. The room was curated, not lived in. It reflected Jonathan's approach to fatherhood. Expensive, polished, but hollow. "I've given him everything money can buy," Jonathan said, his voice tight with defensiveness. Marcus met his gaze calmly. "Everything but you." The words landed with devastating weight. Jonathan had heard countless critiques in his career, of strategy, of deals, of leadership, but none had ever cut this deep. His defenses collapsed, leaving only the truth he could no longer deny. He had built an empire and lost sight of the kingdom that truly mattered. Over the following weeks, Jonathan began experimenting with what he had learned. He started coming home earlier, resisting the urge to fill silence with instructions. He tried kneeling beside Daniel instead of towering above him, letting the boy dictate their play. At first it was awkward, unnatural, and Daniel often pulled away. But slowly, small breakthroughs emerged. An unprompted smile, a shared laugh, the fleeting brush of his son's hand against his. Each moment, though fragile, was a victory. Still, the old world clawed at him. His board grew restless at his absences. Investors questioned his focus, and the press whispered of instability at Hale Enterprises. Rivals circled like vultures, eager to exploit any weakness. Jonathan felt the tug-of-war inside him intensify. One world promised security, wealth, and status. The other offered a connection so personal, so profound, that it terrified him with its vulnerability. The collision of those worlds reached its boiling point when an aggressive investor launched a hostile attempt to seize control of Hale Enterprises. Jonathan's presence was demanded at a critical vote that would determine the company's future. The meeting was scheduled for the same evening as a therapy session Marcus had arranged, one where Daniel was finally willing to try group interaction with other children. For Daniel it was a monumental step. For Jonathan it was a choice between empire and son. On the day of the vote, Jonathan sat in his office, staring at the agenda while his phone lit with calls. His reflection in the glass window was that of a man divided. Behind him, Daniel sat quietly with his dinosaur, awaiting the session. Marcus's earlier words echoed in his mind. "He doesn't need your empire. He just needs you." Jonathan rose suddenly, startling his assistants. He handed the folder to his deputy with a curt instruction. "Handle it. If we lose, then we lose." The room erupted in protest, but Jonathan had already made his choice. He took Daniel by the hand, guiding him out of the office tower and into the waiting car. That evening, Jonathan sat cross-legged on the floor of a modest therapy room, Daniel at his side, surrounded by children who laughed and stumbled through play. Marcus stood nearby, offering quiet encouragement. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't thinking about numbers or strategy. He was simply present, imperfect, uncertain, but present. When Daniel, after a hesitant pause, reached out and handed his dinosaur to another child, Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something vast. trust, openness, growth. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him a small nod, as if to say, "This is what it means to be here." Jonathan knew then that the central conflict of his life was no longer between power and vulnerability, but between the man he had been and the father he was becoming. The next morning began like most mornings in Jonathan Hale's life. The skyline glittered outside his window. His schedule was packed down to the minute, and his phone buzzed with the demands of markets, shareholders and politicians. But beneath the steady hum of his empire, something restless gnawed at him. He had not forgotten the image of Marcus crouched at his son's side, easing Daniel into calm with a patience that no therapist, no expensive specialist, no carefully researched strategy had managed. It was not expertise Jonathan had witnessed. It was something purer, something rooted in humanity rather than knowledge. That truth unsettled him, for he had built his life on control, on the arrogance that skill and money could master all things. Daniel, as usual, sat silently at breakfast, pushing a spoon around his bowl with no interest in eating. Jonathan watched him with unusual stillness, resisting the urge to instruct, to push, to command. He found himself thinking of Marcus's words. Sometimes it helps to let them lead. So he sat back, and when Daniel eventually lifted the spoon to his lips without prompting, Jonathan felt an unexpected surge of quiet victory. It wasn't the spoonful of cereal that mattered. It was the fact that the boy had chosen it himself. But Jonathan was not a man who left mysteries unresolved. He found himself obsessing over Marcus throughout the day. Who was this man? How had he learned to reach his son so naturally? Was it chance, or did he know something more? By evening, Jonathan's decision was firm. He would return to that restaurant. Not because of the food, not because of appearances, but because he needed answers. And though he struggled to admit it even to himself, he needed help. That night, Jonathan guided Daniel back into the same restaurant. The staff greeted him with polished smiles, but he ignored them, scanning the room. He spotted Marcus near the back, carrying a tray. His movements efficient but unhurried. Jonathan raised a hand slightly, and Marcus noticed him, offering a respectful nod before approaching the table. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said, his tone professional. His eyes flicked toward Daniel, who clutched his dinosaur again but seemed calmer than the night before. "Back so soon?" Jonathan hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Yes, my son, he did well here yesterday." Marcus crouched slightly, just enough to catch Daniel's line of sight without forcing it. "Hey buddy, Dino hungry again?" Daniel tilted the dinosaur toward Marcus in response. Marcus chuckled softly. "Thought so." He stood. "I'll bring something simple." Jonathan studied him as he walked away. There was nothing extraordinary in Marcus's uniform, just black slacks, a white shirt, an apron. Yet he carried himself with a composure that filled the space around him, not by command but by reassurance. It struck Jonathan how easily this man moved through the world, unburdened by the weight of proving himself. When Marcus returned with plain pasta and a side of breadsticks, Daniel ate with little fuss, occasionally placing his dinosaur on the edge of the plate as if sharing. Jonathan felt both relief and an uncomfortable sting. Why did it seem so effortless for a stranger? When Marcus turned to leave, Jonathan stopped him. "Sit for a moment," he said. His tone softened by an unfamiliar vulnerability. Marcus looked surprised but set the tray aside and slid into the seat across from him. "Yes, sir." Jonathan folded his hands, searching for words. "What you did yesterday with my son. No one has ever reached him like that. Not therapist, not specialist, not me." His voice tightened, the admission heavier than he expected. "How did you know what to do?" Marcus leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't know. I just paid attention. Kids like him. They notice when you're trying to control them. Sometimes you have to step into their world instead of forcing them into yours." He glanced at Daniel, who was still quietly nibbling. "It's not complicated. It's just listening differently." Jonathan frowned. Listening differently. The phrase echoed in his mind, irritating him with its simplicity. He had spent fortunes on experts, seminars, diagnostic reports, and yet this waiter boiled it down to 2 words. "You think I haven't tried?" Jonathan asked, sharper than he intended. Marcus didn't flinch. "I don't doubt you've tried, sir. But sometimes trying too hard is the problem. He feels it." He shuts down. The truth of it stung, and Jonathan looked away. He hated feeling inadequate, hated exposing the rawness of his failure. Yet here was a man of modest means, speaking plainly, with no fear of offending the most powerful man in the room. "Why do you care?" Jonathan asked suddenly. "You don't know me. You don't know him." Marcus's gaze softened. "Because he's a kid. And kids deserve patience. Doesn't matter who their parents are." Something in Jonathan's chest shifted. An uncomfortable warmth, a recognition he wasn't ready to name. He sat back, exhaling heavily. The rest of the evening passed with Marcus occasionally checking in, always with small gestures aimed more at Daniel than at Jonathan. By the time they left, Jonathan knew he couldn't dismiss what he had seen. The following week, Jonathan returned again. And again. Each time, Marcus found ways to gently coax Daniel into participating, choosing his own food, stacking sugar packets into towers, humming softly when the restaurant grew too loud. Jonathan observed, storing every detail like a man studying an unfamiliar language. But what unsettled him most wasn't Daniel's progress. It was Marcus himself. He discovered, through quiet inquiries to the restaurant manager, that Marcus had once studied education but had dropped out to support his younger brothers after their parents passed. He worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs, never boasting, never complaining. Jonathan found himself lingering after meals, engaging him in conversation that stretched further each time. About patience, about resilience, about life beyond privilege. It dawned on Jonathan that he looked forward to these evenings, not simply for Daniel's sake, but for his own. In Marcus's presence, he felt stripped of his armor, forced to confront the hollowness of a life spent chasing power while failing the one person who mattered most. One evening, after Daniel had eaten calmly and fallen asleep against Jonathan's side in the booth, Jonathan spoke with quiet intensity. "You've done more for him in weeks than I've managed in years. Tell me what it is you see that I don't." Marcus hesitated before answering. "I see a father who wants to connect but doesn't know how to stop being a CEO long enough to just be dad. He doesn't need your empire, sir. He just needs you to kneel down and hold the dinosaur with him." Jonathan sat in silence, the words pressing into him like a brand. For a man who had been untouchable, untamed by criticism, it was a revelation both brutal and freeing. He realized he had found not just someone who understood his son, but someone who held up a mirror to the man he had become. As he carried his sleeping boy out into the night, Jonathan knew with startling clarity that his life was shifting. Marcus was not just an incidental figure in his story. He was the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Subscribe my channel for more videos, thanks. So here is the story. Jonathan Hale was a man who commanded entire cities without raising his voice. At 46, the billionaire CEO had forged an empire of steel, glass, and algorithms, and yet when he walked through the shimmering lobby of his corporation, the silence that followed him felt less like reverence and more like fear. His board bowed, his employees stiffened, but behind his expensive suits and curt nods lived a man who had forgotten what softness felt like. Jonathan was efficient, precise, and utterly impenetrable. To him, every problem had a solution with a price tag. Every obstacle could be erased with enough power. But there was one problem money refused to bend to his will. His 9-year-old son, Daniel, lived in a world Jonathan could not enter. Autism had given the boy rhythms, sensitivities, and silences that his father could neither decode nor conquer. Daniel communicated sparingly, often only with gestures, sometimes with sharp cries that pierced the quiet of their mansion. Jonathan loved his son with a fierce, almost animal loyalty, but love without understanding left him helpless. The boy's small hands would flap when overwhelmed. his gaze darting away from human faces as if the world burned too bright to endure. Jonathan often stood in the doorway of Daniel's room at night, watching him line up toy cars in meticulous rows, wanting to step in but never knowing how. He could build skyscrapers, but he could not build a bridge to his only child. On a late autumn evening, determined to try once more, Jonathan dismissed the army of nannies, tutors, and assistants and decided to take Daniel out himself. They entered a restaurant where the walls gleamed with marble, and chandeliers dripped light like melting glass. It was the sort of place where Jonathan was greeted instantly. His name carried on whispers, his table prepared without a word. Daniel clutched a small plastic dinosaur, his fingers white around it, and followed reluctantly as his father guided him inside. The moment they sat down, Jonathan realized he had underestimated the task. The clattering of cutlery, the swish of servers, the steady murmur of conversations formed a wall of sound Daniel could not scale. His breathing grew shallow, his small frame stiffening as though every noise struck his nerves like sparks. Jonathan, already drawing the eyes of curious onlookers, tried to distract him with the menu. "Look, Daniel, they have pasta. You like pasta?" His voice came out too firm, too businesslike, and Daniel shook his head violently, clutching his dinosaur tighter. Then came the storm. Daniel pushed the menu away, his breathing sharp and frantic. His small voice broke into cries that drew the attention of half the room. He curled in on himself, refusing food, refusing touch. Jonathan froze, his throat tightening. He felt the stares, judgment from strangers, whispers about the untouchable billionaire who could not even handle his own child. He tried reaching for his son's shoulder, but Daniel jerked back, the rejection cutting deeper than Jonathan could admit. For the first time in years, the man who intimidated governments and corporations sat helpless, staring at his boy and realizing he had no idea what to do. It was then that a figure emerged, not dressed in a tailored suit, not holding a tablet full of solutions, but carrying nothing more than a quiet presence. A young black waiter, tall and lean, approached their table with the soft steadiness of someone who understood storms. His name tag read Marcus. He did not address Jonathan at first, nor did he glance at the curious patrons nearby. Instead, he crouched down to Daniel's eye level, lowering himself until his posture made him smaller, less threatening. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said gently, his voice calm like water smoothing stone. "That's a pretty cool dinosaur you've got there. Is he hungry?" Daniel's sobs faltered, his attention snagged by the unexpected question. He blinked at Marcus, clutching the toy tighter. Jonathan sat frozen, caught between irritation at the intrusion and awe at what he was seeing. Marcus didn't push. He simply set down a small plate of plain breadsticks, placing one beside the dinosaur. "I think T-Rex might want to eat first," he said, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world. Daniel hesitated, then reached out with tentative fingers, moving the dinosaur toward the breadstick. His cries softened to small hiccups. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he took the breadstick and nibbled at it himself. The room around them seemed to exhale. Jonathan felt his chest tighten with something he could not name. Shame, perhaps, but also a strange, piercing gratitude. How had this stranger succeeded in 2 minutes where he had failed for 9 years? Marcus glanced briefly at Jonathan, his tone respectful but steady. "Sometimes it helps to let them lead. He'll eat if he feels like it's his choice." Jonathan, a man unaccustomed to instruction, simply nodded, unable to form words. He watched as Daniel continued to nibble quietly, his small frame finally relaxing. The waiter stood, gave Jonathan a short nod, and walked away without asking for thanks, vanishing back into the rhythm of the restaurant as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Jonathan, something extraordinary had happened. He stared at his son, who now chewed contentedly, the plastic dinosaur lying next to the breadstick as though a battle had been won. Jonathan realized his hands were trembling. He had lived a life where every door opened at his command, every problem dissolved with his money, Yet the one key he needed had been handed to him by a stranger in an apron. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. Jonathan forced himself to keep still, watching Daniel eat with quiet fascination, as though seeing him for the first time. He caught Marcus's eye once across the room, but the waiter only offered a small, knowing smile before moving on. When the plates were cleared and the bill discreetly placed on the table, Jonathan paid without thinking, his mind elsewhere. That night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep in the back seat of the car, Jonathan sat in the silence of his penthouse study. He replayed the moment over and over, the gentle tone, the crouched posture, the way Marcus had given Daniel a choice rather than a command. It was so simple, so human, and yet Jonathan had never thought of it. He had been so busy conquering the world that he had never learned how to kneel for his own son. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan Hale did not feel powerful. He felt small. And in that smallness, he felt the faint stirrings of something else, something he could not yet define, but that pulled at him like a thread demanding to be followed. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. This encounter was not the end. It was the beginning of something he could no longer ignore.